Hello and welcome to Cheers to Fears, the place that combines horror movies and alcohol for your entertainment.
Hello. Do you want to play a game?
Be food and drink and ghosts, and perhaps even a few murders. You're all invited.
Today we are making a drinking game for Skinamarink, written and directed by Kyle Edward Ball. Ball really came out of nowhere with Skinamarink, as this movie and many other short stories and videos are based on people's dreams. With a budget of around $15,000, Skinamarink has already made over $800,000, so to say how profitable the movie is would be an understatement.
In the movie, two children, Kaylee and Kevin, wake up and notice that all their windows and doors in their house are missing. What happens next is an absolute unique take on film that feels like a dream with Lynchian inspiration, so have fun unpacking this movie. Just a bit of a forewarning, the rules do have minor spoilers in them, so just be forewarned, but I don't think it's going to be really anything to take you too much out of the movie. Also, we won't have drinking totals as we do with most of our videos, since it was released earlier this year. Now, let's move on to the rules.
So of course, we're always bringing back our first rule, which is death. And in this movie, it kind of proves how abstract this movie is, because a lot of the deaths can be left up to interpretation, and there's no, I guess, concrete deaths that you see. You don't see any death.
Yeah.
It's all either implied or left up in the air as to whether it happened or not.
Yeah, so literally, this rule can be left up to anybody's interpretation.
Yeah.
One example of this, could rather be that the whole movie itself could be based in like the afterlife and what's happening there.
True.
And it could be just placed in a different realm.
Yeah, that's true. So it's really up in the air for how many drinks this will give you, but I can guarantee at least once you should drink for it. There's one specific point in the movie that I think you should absolutely take a drink for it. So
I think that
it's worth including.
I'll agree with you at least once.
Minimum.
Minimum once.
There's one scene in particular that I'm thinking of.
Yep, there's one scene in particular. However, let's move on to the next rule. The next rule, as always, is scream, cries, and yells, but there isn't lots in this movie. It's fairly silent, as there isn't even a lot of talking.
Very, very little talking. A lot of the screams are jump scares, and even those are few and far between. So yeah, not a lot of screaming, but there's a handful, I'd say. Anyways, let's move on to rule number 3, and this one will give you a little bit more drinks for sure. It's whenever Lego is in the scene. It's straightforward, but it happens often.
Pretty much Lego's almost in every scene, along with the TV.
I guess it's worth saying it's hard to keep track of what is a scene. Like, what's a new scene? When does it happen? I would follow the guideline of whenever it cuts to a new location or like a different camera, and it's in that scene, then you take a drink for it, because I mean it's not so obvious when it's a new scene, I guess.
For this movie especially, like, it feels like almost a little bit of a run on at some points. The next rule is whenever the flickering nightlight is seen, you take a sip. And there's honestly not a lot to say about this rule. Just kind of happens off and on.
There is one point where you see the nightlight on the floor, so it's not flickering, it's not even plugged in, so it won't work. It's up to you if you want to take a drink for that or not, but for the most time, it happens in the beginning of the movie. It's, I'd say, the first half, maybe. Every time it cuts to the hallway, you see that nightlight, and it's flickering. Anyways, let's move on to rule number 5, and this is kind of the main point of this movie, or I guess the main question of this movie is whenever something appears or disappears, I guess, or whenever it goes missing randomly. And this is the main thing that makes you feel kind of unsettled in the movie and makes you question, like, what is actually going on? Why is this happening? What's the reason behind it? You know, that's the main thing that you're kind of wondering throughout this film.
It does look good for the budget that it was presented with.
Yeah, that's true.
It kind of does it in the same way as Marble Hornets, if anyone's ever seen that, where it just kind of like has like emphasis, like staticky around it, and then like just randomly like takes it away from out of the scene.
Yeah.
So it looks super well done. The camera's still, but everything just kind of moves off set, and then it looks like it disappears. So it's a little bit bone chilling, but done very well for a low budget.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, true, like on a practical standpoint, like I'm curious how they actually did it, because it looks like for example, a window randomly disappears. It looks like a real window, and it looks like a real wall when the window disappears. Yeah. So I'm curious actually what his route was for that to make it work.
One theory that I have is how they might have done it is Ball could have just had like the window with the wall with like the same paint or something like that, and because of like the bad camera effects, he could have just moved to a completely different wall. Yeah, which I would find.
But then there was doors. Well, there was doors in there in the frame as well.
Yeah,
so it'd be hard to replicate like that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think it was mostly editing techniques just to blend it out so it looked like a finished wall.
Yeah. Yeah, the reason why I'm so curious by that, by the way, is just because it's such a low budget movie.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the main thing.
That brings us to rule number 6, which is whenever a light is switched on or off. Well, I don't think it's anyone else besides Nosferatu.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious when this happens, simply because you're always looking, especially when it's dark. You're always looking, and it's just a dark room or whatever, and then all of a sudden you see a hallway light just turn on. That one's super obvious when it happens. Or it'll be at a scene where the light's already on, and then you see it turn off. It happens quite often throughout the movie again. We don't have totals, obviously, like we mentioned before, but I think it'll give you a good handful of drinks for sure. But that being said, let's move on to rule number 7. And this is whenever something is unnaturally on the ceilings or walls. It's almost like it's stuck up there. It's kind of symbolic in some ways. It's like this... It symbolizes that the children's lives are upside down, I guess you could say, is one way to look at it. But yeah, it's just, again, one of those things that makes you question, like, okay, what's actually going on in this film? Why is shit on the ceiling when it's not supposed to be there, you know? It makes you ask questions, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those rules that have a deeper meaning to it. Anyways, let's move on to rule number 8, which is whenever you hear heavy breathing or whispering. There wasn't too much talking, whispering in this movie, but I mean, comparison to the other rules, there's probably going to be quite a bit.
There's quite a few whispers for sure. But it's always very muffled, and they sometimes, that's the weird thing about this movie, is sometimes there's subtitles built into the movie, like they put them there intentionally, but then sometimes they're saying stuff and you can't understand it, but there's no subtitles. So, I don't know if that was intentional, but either way, it was like, okay, why aren't you putting subtitles for everything or none of it? Like, choose one or the other. That was something I was questioning. But, yeah, it's pretty straightforward rule. But let's move on to the second last rule of this drinking game. It's whenever there's a close-up shot of the TV. And typically it's playing cartoons on it. But it does happen quite frequently, I'd say.
Yeah, it's playing public domain cartoons. We were with somebody else when we were watching, and they knew exactly what the cartoon was. They said they watched it when they were young.
Yeah, she grew up with it.
Yeah, and now she can't watch it anymore, so tough luck. But anyways, it generally appears with Lego, so I think that's going to be one of the other rules that is definitely going to be up there.
And for half the movie, the TV is the only thing lighting up the room. So half the time the TV is the lighting for the set, I guess. So it's an interesting use for it for sure. And with it playing cartoons, it helps because they're children, you know, it's what you would expect them to be watching.
Definitely. Anyways, let's move on to the final rule, which is whenever you see or hear the parents. A deep dive actually asked the question whether the parents are good or bad. We can't really get into too more of that just because we'll have that for the podcast episode.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth saying we aren't going to do a full episode on Skinamarink. Unless you guys want to see it, we could easily do a full-length episode on Skinamarink. But what we're thinking about doing is talking about the movies that we watched in January, this being one of them, and that's when we kind of go a little bit deeper into each of those movies and talk about what our thoughts on it and stuff are.
Yeah.
But if you do want to see a full-length video on Skinamarink, a full-length discussion or conversation between us, let us know. We could definitely work that out. There's definitely lots to talk about, even though it doesn't seem like it on the surface, but there's definitely things to talk about.
There's tons to break down within the movie itself and what everything means.
For sure. But for this video, we're not going to be talking about that just to avoid spoilers. Because that's just... We want to keep this a drinking game, not a review or anything like that. So, that wraps up all the drinking rules that we had for this game. Obviously, like we said a couple times, there's not going to be any totals for this drinking game, but I think it'll be a reasonable amount of drinks. Maybe 3.5 to 4.5.
I think, about 4 is a good call. It's really hard to tell just because we see rules, but we don't actively count when we see it for the first time.
Exactly.
But admittedly, it's not the best movie to get intoxicated for, because obviously we've been kind of addressing the elephant in the room throughout the episode. It's a movie that requires a lot of outside thinking.
Yeah, you have to think about it, especially after you're done watching it. You have to be contemplating and thinking about, okay, what did this mean? What did this whole movie? What's the point of it? You have to think about it. That being said, a lot of people, I think, could find this movie quite boring, especially if you go into it thinking that it's going to be some typical movie with a plot, a beginning, middle, end. It's not really like that. It's a little bit more, I'll say, artsy, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And there's definitely things to appreciate about it, especially with a $15,000 budget. But that being said, if you're just an average movie watcher, alcohol could help you because it might give you something to look for while you're playing or watching the movie. You know?
Just a little bit something extra, just in case you get bored of the overall atmosphere of the movie.
So I think it could be beneficial, but also diminish the experience a little bit.
Yeah.
Depending how you look at it.
I think one of the best things about the movie is jump scares if you are watching it with a crowd, just to see everybody else's reaction. But other than that,
they're few and far between, at least. They don't rely on jump scares overall.
Not at all, like some other more recent movies.
And the best thing about the jump scares, I will say, obviously not to get too much detail, but there's no music or anything to build up the tension. He does it through seeing a black room and you're looking for something. You're looking to see, is something there? It's hard to tell. Is something there? I can't actually tell.
Yeah.
And then that's when he kind of gets you there's no noise happening. And then all of a sudden there's a jump scare. Yeah,
it's like you're specifically trying to look for something, looking, and then it just kind of pops out at you. Especially when you're hyper-focused on the screen.
Yeah.
Speaking of things being hyper-focused on the screen, generally we talked about how the TV is pretty much the only thing lighting it up.
Yeah.
And Lego being there, those are going to probably be the two heavy hitters with rules.
I think those would be the biggest ones for sure. I think a lot of the other rules will give you a good amount of drinks, but those two will be the most for sure.
Definitely. And with all that being said, we hope you enjoyed our drinking game on Skinamarink. If you ended up playing the game alongside the movie, or if you have any other feedback suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next video, which is going to be on Tetsuo the Iron Man. We're going to be making a drinking game, we're going to be making drinks, and we're going to have a podcast episode on it even, so stay tuned. So, thanks for tuning in, and this is us saying,
Cheers to fears.